So I think all of us have have at least met Léonie. She is such an outstanding lady that it is it's truly amazing to see all that she has done. She's been a writer, an editor, a producer, a collaborator. She has won incredible number of awards, and she has just, I think, done it all. Her topic tonight is about shunning books with footnotes. And I think that the topic is kind of one of those ones that we don't think about as often as we should. But if you're in the nonfiction world, especially, but also sometimes the fiction world, it is something that you need to think about. So I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn the meeting over to Léonie.
Okay. And I'm doing this as if we're going out into the universe with the symbols of planets and stars, because some people think footnotes belong to a different universe and they don't live in that universe and they don't want to live in that universe. There's something terrifying about that particular universe. Just to be upfront about this, I got to know footnotes as a child. My mother was a college professor. My grandmother didn't read books with footnotes. My father didn't care one way or the other. He could take it or leave it. When I was about 10, I started being apprenticed to edit my mother's scholarly papers, and they were jam full of footnotes. So I didn't have a chance to be afraid of them. I didn't have a chance to think, well, that doesn't apply to me. And I will tell you also how I got to find them amusing and how they made me think sometimes. They weren't just references to dull books in libraries. When I was growing up, there was this split between scholarly publishing and popular publishing. And popular books were the ones that didn't have the footnotes. And education, quote unquote, educational books at an upper level had footnotes, and so did scholarly books. But people who were just going into a bookstore generally were not looking for anything with a footnote. If it had a footnote, unless they were assigned that book by a professor or a teacher, they wouldn't buy it. They would just turn around and walk the other way. So that was how I learned there was a distinction between scholarly and popular. And one of the ways I learned that was in my mother's library. She had a study and a library. In her study, there were books of all sorts. And there were two books in particular that I was interested in. One of them was Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa. My mother was an anthropologist. And right next to it on the shelf, there was a big, thick volume. Coming of Age in Samoa was a little paperback, a little popular paperback. The big fat book next to it was the report of the territorial governor of the same area that Margaret Mead had been in. And looking at those two books together, and I sneaked a look at both of them when I was about 10, because that was when I was in the study proofreading footnotes. There were lots of footnotes in that other book. There were lots of references. There were no footnotes in the little skinny paperback. And so I got to know the difference just by experience. And I continued to have a kind of double life, reading books with footnotes when I wasn't going to school, because it was some years before I was in a school where you had to have books with footnotes, because for kids, they don't have any footnotes. And so I had this life of reading adult, quote unquote, adult books. And I don't mean porn. I just mean books for adults and books for people in academia, and popular books. It was normal to be in both worlds. But I learned later that it wasn't normal for most people to be in both worlds. It was just normal for me to be there. And my favorite footnote, very favorite footnote probably of all time, I got hooked on those summertime reading programs that the library used to conduct. And after I was in college, I did that on my own. I would go to the college bookstore and buy a bunch of books on sale at the end of the term and read them over the summer. Well, this was one of the books that I read, and I got a real kick and a real piece of information to think about from a footnote in the first chapter of this book. Stringful of Bar is an interesting guy. At the time that I read this, I thought he had to be English with a name like that, but he wasn't. He was an American scholar who, with a friend of his, created something called the Great Books courses that used to be very, very popular in colleges. And they would make you read all of the great, quote unquote, great books of the Western tradition. And one of the things they started with, of course, was the Greco-Roman classics. Well, this is a history of ancient Greece that he wrote. And in the first chapter, there's a footnote. And he talks about people reporting from that culture that they had spoken to or had some kind of connection, personal connection with one or another ancient Greek god. And the rest of the footnote says they were some of the most brilliant minds of the Western tradition, and I still seek evidence that they lied or were mistaken. And I looked at that footnote and I said, this is an interesting guy. I mean, I have to know more about the situation. I want to know more about the civilization. I want to know more about this person. And that's when I started finding out what he had done. And I was one of the recipients of that Great Books course because we went through part of it as an introduction to going to college. And so there was a connection, and I didn't even realize it when I picked up this book. But if I hadn't looked at that footnote and said, I've got to know more about this guy, there's something very interesting and unusual about him. And there was something interesting and unusual about him. He's no longer with us, of course, but his book is still being sold on Amazon. And it's been being sold on Amazon since 1962. So he must have done something right. His book is, by the way, full of footnotes. So I went on and did a lot more things with footnotes. My first publishing job was I spent, let's see, from 1969 to 1974 on the staff of a scholarly publication called Current Musicology, which sounds very forbidding. It was a lot more fun than it sounds, but we had footnotes everywhere because we were at the Columbia University Department of Musicology, and it was required that you have footnotes in all articles and correspondence, and you name it, it had a footnote. So I was immersed in footnotes because I was also in graduate school at the time. So footnotes were standard. And they led up to something which became a doctoral dissertation for me. But I did a lot of interviewing for that particular book as well. So I had, again, this dual aspect to what I was doing. One of them was library research, which was obviously required for doctoral dissertations. And the other was like an oral history component to the research, which was unusual at that time. This was back in the 1970s. So eventually it became a book after I defended it and went through about 100 publishers who didn't want to publish it. I found a university press at Fairleigh Dickinson that did want to publish it. And doctoral dissertations, as the slide tells you, have lots and lots of footnotes. Are people scared of the book? I don't know. When I was putting this talk together, I went and looked at Abe's books, which is a used book large used book seller on the internet. And look at what they were selling my doctoral dissertation for. I nearly fainted. $3,500. So I don't think people are some people are not that scared of footnotes. And you can actually learn a lot from footnotes. I included some not just reference footnotes in this book. I talked a bit about the people that I interviewed and what their connection was to the person I was writing about, because they were very interesting in their own right. They were diplomats and artists and very, very interesting people altogether. So I put those in the footnotes because I couldn't put them in the text. It wasn't, what's the word I'm looking for? Since it was a standard life and works, those pieces of information didn't really belong in the text itself. But I thought people needed them for context, and I thought people needed them to understand who the person was and how connected these people remained to her. This is a very talented composer, was the first woman, French composer, was the first woman to win the Prix de Rome in composition. And I was coming on the scene about 50 years after she passed away. And the people who were talking to me about her, who had known her, when I spoke to them, it sounded as if she was in the room. Her presence was so real that I thought it deserved some kind of mention, that her energy and her connection to these people still remained vivid after all that time. And so that was part of the reason for those footnotes in that book. The one after that, this is not exactly, because I had another book in the meantime that was a textbook, and the textbook was for college, and so it contained a lot of footnotes. Then I did her sister. And her sister was a whole other thing, because she was a very famous teacher of music and particularly composition. And she taught all sorts of musicians, including film composers and classical composers. She taught Aaron Copland. She also taught the film composer Michel Legrand, a lot of American composers, some French composers, a lot of English composers, and even one from Argentina. And I met a Colombian composer when I was working on the Lily Boulanger book, who was a student of hers as well. So I had footnotes when I first wrote the manuscript, and this was a book that I did for W.W. Norton, which was considered at that time scholarly and textbook. Well, I happened by the luck of the draw to get an editor who decided this was going to be her first popular book. And so the manuscript came to her with lots of footnotes. And she said, no, this is going to be my first trade book, and all the footnotes have to come out. And I said, are you sure you want to do that? Oh, yes, we have to do that. And then I had the choice, because it was a very prestigious publisher, whether I didn't want them to publish the book or I did want them to publish the book. So I did let them publish the book without the footnotes. And some people who read this book said, where are the footnotes? Because expectations are important in readers, as we know. And the convention for books from that publisher was they always have footnotes. And so mine was the first one without footnotes. So I got a little bit of flack for that. What can an author do about it? Absolutely nothing. Just sit there and take it. the question is, how does it affect sales? And my answer is ultimately it didn't. In fact, not too long ago, I had to go back to Norton because I had found that there were pirate publishers. You know, on the internet, there are people who steal your books and give them as free downloads. And one of them had claimed to have given 40,000 downloads of this book. And so it affected my personal sales. It did not affect the download of the book. Obviously, people wanted to read it, with or without footnotes. So I can't say that the footnote or lack of footnote listings in this book ultimately affected it. I still have all the file folders for all of the chapters with the original documentation. So if somebody ever wants to put one out with documentation, I can just go right back to those files and all the footnotes are right there. Now, this one is a slightly different situation. This is more recent. This one I published in 2021, the end of 2021. And it has 499 footnotes. I went back and counted them. And it has footnotes for protection, my protection. I was the first person, and I think I'm still the only one, to get a gag order on a guardianship case lifted so that I could write this, because I had promised my mother that I would write this book. And then a judge put a gag order on me and said, you may not write anything on the entire subject of your mother or guardianship or anything like that. You must not mention your family. So it took me 5 years in court to get the gag order lifted. And then I did not want to have a situation where there was a he said, she said situation. I wanted to document everything. And that's the reason for the 499 footnotes. And the documentation must have been satisfactory because nobody sued me. And it's been out for 4 years. I think it's long past the statute of limitations for that, which is a year. So I think that it did serve its purpose. And someday I may put out a version of this that's streamlined and doesn't have all those footnotes. But other people seem to have understood that there was a good reason for the footnotes, and especially people I've met who have been in similar situations definitely understood why everything was documented. And you will very often see, as I did at the beginning of the book, put out a disclaimer and say anything that isn't documented is described to the best of my recollection, because I don't claim to be perfect, but I do try to document as much as I can in this book. So I could possibly take the footnotes out of this at this point because all the information has now been published and has been out for a while. But I couldn't take them out when I was publishing it at first. And so that's another reason why people put footnotes in, so that people reading it know that you have documentation. The next book is a popular book. It's even got cartoons in it. And I was just doing a skip through the meadow of legal services that are available to people who don't want to or can't put an attorney on retainer. And I did that because I had over a dozen attorneys in the course of that legal battle that I just mentioned to you in the last book. That was a 14-year legal battle that ended up with 5 years trying to get the documents released. And so in that process, I met quite a few attorneys and they helped me. And I got a feel for different sorts of attorneys, different legal services, what they can and can't do for you. And so that's why I wrote this particular book. One of the podcast hosts that I spoke about this book with said, gee, to his listeners, gee, you should get this book. It even has cartoons. But it was very funny that it was such a potentially dark and somber topic, talking about people's legal problems, that I just figured I needed to put some cartoons in to liven it up. But I had to have 12 footnotes even in this book in order to document. One of the things that happened was one of the legal services started listing attorneys and rating them. And the attorneys sued the listing service and said, how dare you say that about us? And so I needed to document that this happened, and also that the attorneys who were complaining about getting negative ratings lost their lawsuit, and the negative ratings are still up there. Whether they deserve them or not, that's a whole other question. So it was to avoid trouble again. And that's one of the cartoons from the book. And it probably would be the all-time bestseller. And then we come to the last one, which is kind of provocative. I guess the title is provocative, but the reasons for the footnotes, there are some really hard to believe stories. And in order to document them, I need to go back to the original sources and show people how to see them for themselves, because some of them are really, really difficult to credit. And I had a cartoon there as well, which I will show you in a minute. But I wanted people to feel how it is for people in that system. Sometimes when it goes wrong, it can go very wrong, very quickly and very painfully. And I wanted to offer people some ways to mitigate that sort of damage or prevent it altogether. But I actually needed 114 footnotes to do it. And it isn't that long a book. So I was right back to the footnotes again. And one of the things that happened when I submitted this book, I self-published it through Dayspring Resources, which is a company that I own. And when I sent it to the editor who was working with me, she said, you've got to document this. You have to document that. I thought I was writing a popular book, so I didn't include the footnotes, but fortunately I had them in my research file. Oh, you've got to document. You can't just leave that hanging out there. You've got to document it. So I ended up with 114 footnotes right back to the beginning. And I didn't think I was going to meet them. It's a good thing I kept those research files. It really is. And this was how I looked at the whole situation of when it goes wrong. And it really does go wrong. But it's the whole family that's tied up that way. I could talk more about the feeling of footnotes. I know that when I look at 19th century books, a lot of the footnotes are discursive. Sometimes they're essays, fairly long essays sometimes. And it's a way that a scholar at that period could talk directly to readers and have a more unbuttoned approach to what they're thinking. And so footnotes really have multiple purposes. They can let you into the mental process of the person who's writing them. They can document or send you to a specific place to get that information. And back when I was first writing, it was very hard to get that. This was before computers, before the internet. If you told somebody that it was in a documentary archive somewhere, they would have to spend maybe a month finding the right archive and going there, or corresponding with the right person at that archive who was responsible for that particular part of the collection. Now things are so much more fun. They're so much easier. You can find people more easily. I don't know whether you can find the documents more easily, except if they're already posted on the internet. You still might need to find the librarian or the archivist who's in charge of these documents and get them to release them to you. I remember being told years ago, I used to go to librarians' conventions. There was a wonderful man by the name of Robert Stevenson who put me on to a lot of excellent research ideas. And one of them was go to librarians' conventions because they're always interested in talking about their collections or sharing information about archives. And you'll be surprised how many things are not logged on. They're not discussed. They're not in the standard references on archives. And I found that he was absolutely right. I went to a number of librarians' conventions. I found the most amazing information there. They also knew about people with private collections of documents who were in their area, and they could refer you to them. And the people in Louisiana always said, don't ask anybody about anything that's in, this was before the flood. Don't ask anybody about anything that's in their basement, because if it's worth anything, they've got it up in the attic. And they were right about that for sure. But I found a number of archives in Europe and in this country that were not in any published source and were either privately owned or they were in the library, but they weren't in the card catalog, what was then the card catalog. And now they're not in the National Union catalog or the international catalog that you can find on the internet. They're not there. So you would still need to know that you need to find a human to ask about that, because that changes things materially. I don't know that ChatGPT has any access to anything that isn't on the internet. It combs the internet and it does a really good job of some of this work because it's been programmed to, but it has no access to anything that has not been placed on the internet. So just be aware that if you're trying to put footnotes together and you're doing documentary research, you might find that humans are your best source. So thank you. And if you have any questions or you want to talk about anything else, I'd be very happy to talk to you about it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And again, if you have any more questions or follow up with Léonie, I'm sure she would be willing to receive an email from you and we'll explain to you in a little bit more. But otherwise, one more round of applause and thank you so much.